focus on the Mint countries and indeed with the World Economic Forum on Africa. The question will now be the question of policy. Do we have the policies to drive this? Because besides the population that's likely to expand, the middle class will expand, the growth indices are really good. But what about policy?
That really, I believe, is the challenge that we face here. And which means the responsibility now is on the government to respond appropriately. In fact, my own take of it is that if this will not turn out to be just a talk show for Nigeria now, okay, for those people coming, they know what they are coming for. They are very clear in their minds what they are coming for in Nigeria, okay? But for us, especially our government representatives, they should be looking more at what sort of policies must be emplaced in order for these opportunities we've been talking about, these potentials we've been talking about for decades, will come into reality. And that means then that we must take seriously reforms. And of course, not have this mindset that reform is all about deregulation. It's a lot more to reforms. And what we must also develop as a mindset is that we are competing with the rest of the world for resources. And when you realize that you are competing, then it means you have to sit back strategically and ask yourself, which countries are likely to attract more resources if those resources don't come here?
I think that's the next question I was just about to pose to you.
Good.
Because there are 4 countries in the Mint category.
That's
and,
right.
you know, investors will naturally, yes, 4, they can spread the wealth evenly, but even then they will look at the most attractive. Do you think that we have what it takes amongst the 4 countries that have been mentioned? Especially, are we at par on the other countries in terms of development, or do they look more attractive to investors than we do?
Well, if you look at the 4, you might say in terms of what their governments, just linking it to the last question also, what their governments have done in terms of policies and focus of their development efforts, they probably will appear a little bit more attractive. And that is where our own government should come in at this time. And that is to now come up with policy initiatives that will not only indicate our priorities, but also ensure that those priorities line up with, 1, our own growth and development aspirations, as well as create room for those investors to create wealth. Once you're able to, initiate policies that connect those two, then you practically will unleash.
It seems like we're beginning to see that, though. I mean, we know that power is one area where the government has been going about marketing, the opportunities that exist in that particular sector continues to remain a challenge. But how would you measure investors' appetite for risk? Because you also know the problems associated with power, and that you can already hear the controversy brewing even with those that have bought the newly privatized companies as to whether or not we're paying the right price for power. Do you think that investors really have the appetite to take the risk involved in Nigeria?
All right, now I will cite an instance of something that happened about 2-3 years ago to illustrate this. Now, the Nigerian Economic Summit held in Abuja, and then in the course of that, there was, some rumor that went around about security concerns about the venue. Now, what happened? At some point, there was power outage. And of course, people thought, hey, here we come. But then, a very, very important guest was on the program at that instance. And that was the U.S. ambassador, who remained there for the brief moment of outage before power was restored. And now one of the major investors around the globe had one of their top executives at that event. And I'm talking about General Electric. And he now made a comment, which in fact is what I will refer to in answer to this. And he said, the trouble in Nigeria, so to say, is not in any way comparable to what was going on in Afghanistan. And that GE was doing business in Afghanistan, so they had no reason to consider any security challenges to keep them away from Nigeria. Now, I cited that because it actually happened and I was there when it happened. But the key thing here is this for investors. Any investor that wants to put his money in any country, yes, he has to contend with the country risk, and he has to contend with several other risks. He puts all this on the table. Then he puts them vis-a-vis the return on his investment. So when it comes to risk appetite, you now say, hey, 3 categories of possible investors. Those that are risk averse, and no matter how low the risk is, they say, no, I don't want to go there for whatever reason. There are those who really are ready to take risk, insofar as the promised return is greater than the risk, the possible loss that can result from the risk when they compare them. So for such investors, they will always go to where their money will bring greater return than the loss they can possibly make if the risk crystallizes. And that is what most of them have been saying about Nigeria.
I'm looking at some figures here. This was as at 2013. In fact, that's the most recent figure. Of this means economics, some of the economic indicators here, population, the GDP growth rates. But we had the highest of the growth rates of these countries. We had 2.54%. And now we've got a population of, this here says 175 million. But look at the economics here. The GDP for 2012 was 263 billion. We happen to be the smallest in those main countries. And Indonesia having the biggest, which was $878 billion. Yeah. So I see us having, look, this big population growth, yet the smallest of the economies. How do we connect the dots and maximize the population which we have? Because Turkey, that has the lowest, is having a huge GDP growth of $7.8 billion.
Yeah, now that really is the attraction. And the way it goes is this. You can liken it to, let's say, 2 vehicles on the road, okay, because that's the way we explain this in economics. Now, a car definitely will accelerate faster than a truck, okay? So the bigger an economy is, the more difficult it is to get it up to speed and to also sustain the speed. In fact, this in particular was the attraction China had for many years, because the economy then was medium-sized, but it was growing at a very fast rate. And so it did that consistently over 3 decades, and then became today number 2 in the world in terms of the size of the GDP. So now, looking at the mint, Nigeria has the smallest GDP there. And that in terms of size, first and foremost, tells you that it has potential to grow very fast. Now, with the background of a huge population, of course, my own estimate is about 172 million. Okay? Now, if you look at that sort of population and its distribution, very heavy at the base of the pyramid, that also tells you that as this population goes, if the growth rate does not slow, because we are looking at 3.2% annual growth rate in our population. Now, if that doesn't slow, that means this growth rate of the population will be sustained to the near future. But at the same time, this huge base we have will carry forward. And don't forget, whichever way things are going, people actually are living longer now, historically, and it's also going around the world. And Nigeria is a part of that. So if that happens, that means the population that we have at the base now will also move up, quite all right. Unless the growth rate of the population slows down, the pyramid will remain still fat at the bottom. And that means you are creating markets at different levels throughout that population in terms of a structure. So if you take that vis-a-vis the size of the economy, which gives it advantage of speed in terms of growth. So all we need is just turn to our government and advocate that they should reform as would make it attractive for investors to put their money here and not elsewhere.
I was going to take you back to the issue of government and focus. With that population growth, that means more is required.
That's right.
Now, so those that asked the question, we've had discussions, economic forums, economic planning and all of that. But the issue of focus, how much of those discussions that have been had, conversations I've had, how much of them have been put on ground and how much of it will still be running? As our population is increasing with that growth rate, there will be the demand for jobs.
That's right.
There will be the demand for infrastructure.
Correct.
What do we have? How do we go? And how do we get to that point?
That really is the key issue here. And I will just put it in a very simple manner. Now, when you look at the needs for infrastructure the need to create jobs. The simple question to ask is, what are the critical infrastructure we must put in place? Now, which are those ones that obviously government should not bother itself with? Now, I'm not saying they cannot, but what they should not bother their heads about. For any critical infrastructure that by its nature is bankable, that means if a private investor goes in there, he or she should not have difficulty getting the funds to implement the project. Government should not bother itself getting involved in that. So in which case, you now get the private partners to plan and execute those infrastructure projects. Now the ones that are not bankable, that is for which it will be easy for any private investor to raise funding for, is what government should concern itself with. And then government can now say, yes, we might not be able to find the resources to do this within a year or 2 years. But every project now is phased. And you know how much you can take in from your budget annually to implement such projects. So that is where focus comes in. So, and of course, when you are creating an environment for investors, whether domestic or foreign, you also consider the fact that whoever will put his money in the project as an investor wants to get his money back. So in which case, how do we create an environment that will enable those investors get their monies back? So that becomes the challenge of policy. And that also will also tell us that, look, policies is not just a matter of a pronouncement. It is about what are we aiming to achieve with this policy? What are the planks of that particular policy? The planks of every policy must be such that they are internally consistent.
But if I'm
and called the sequencing.